Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Oxford University Press, it's a matter of great delight for me to welcome you today for the launch of Why India is Not a Great Power Yet, written by Bharat Karnad, Professor of National Security Studies at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Unfortunately, General V.K. Singh couldn't be with us today, as planned earlier. As panelists for today's book discussion, we are honored to have with us today Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, Lieutenant General S.L. Narasimhan, who's yet to arrive, and Rear Admiral K.R. Rajamenon. Jairam Ramesh, former Minister of State of Environment and Forests and Rajya Sabha member, currently chairs the Future Earth Engagement Committee, which is a research platform on global sustainability. He has recently published 2 books with OEP titled Green Signals and Legislating for Justice. Shiv Shankar Menon served as National Security Advisor to the Indian Prime Minister between 2010 and 14. He's also served as the Foreign Secretary of India and is currently Chairman of the Advisory Board of the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi. Rear Admiral K.R. Rajamenon is former Assistant Chief of the Naval Staff for Operations and more recently Chairman of the Task Force on Net Assessment and Simulation, National Security Council. He is also a visiting lecturer at all institutes of higher study of the Indian Armed Forces and has organized the nuclear management courses for Indian service officers. Now, to begin today's program, let us first congratulate Bharat on this notable accomplishment. We're sure that this book will prove to be an audacious, provocative, and brilliantly insightful take on where India stands in terms of its hard power. I now invite Bharat to tell us more about this book. Thanks.
You see the illustration. I think that about aptly describes the essence of the book. Except I think India is really a lamb with lion's clothing. So they've got it wrong. It's not just a shadow of the lamb that the lion is projecting. But we inherently, I think, are a timid people and a timid nation. And that gets reflected in our foreign policies, in our attitude towards the world, external world. And in a sense also, I think, it's a self-justifying kind of a situation wherein we, in a sense, rationalize our own situation, the way we are, the way we react, the way we initiate policies, moves, and so on in the foreign policy arena. As I've tried to analyze the situation, we come up with explanations and rationales as to why we are the way we are. So the very common and popular explanation is, for instance, that most politicians and analysts talk about is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is the whole world is one. Now, the problem with that is no one else acts and believes or acts on that premise. So what we end up doing is hurting ourselves, because if we are all one family, does it really matter if someone else wins, another family member wins? See the point? And in the interstate relations, really, the way the international relations are conducted, there are losers, there are winners, and there are really the inconsequentials. So we fall somewhere between the winners and losers, and have been falling into that category of being fairly inconsequential. And this is a pity, because we have all the attributes of great power, all the attributes, except what I call, and of course we have the hard power, in the sense of having an impressive order of battle, except it is an order of battle that looks good only on paper. It cannot be sustained because we don't have a defense industry of our own. So the wars we fight are short duration conflicts that reach an impasse very quickly. In other words, we do not prepare to fight decisive wars. And you get sucked into that cycle of preparing for such wars, and that, in a sense, becomes your planning predicate in the MOD and elsewhere. I think the thing to note is the great irony. The irony is this, that in the 1950s, when India had nothing, literally it was an impoverished state with no resources, India had a presence in the world. Nehru bestrode the international arena like a giant, even though you had nothing, you had no leverage. He forcefully, in a sense, inserted himself in the Cold War politics. He became, by sheer dint of will, as it were, the balancer between the rival Cold War blocs. And he didn't stop at he used morality. And this is our problem. We believe in our moral postures. Well, actually, he didn't. And this is not really understood or appreciated sufficiently enough. Even as Nehru was talking disarmament and advocated disarmament, he seeded and sustained a nuclear weapons program. That was, by the way, nuclear weapons thrust of the nuclear energy program was from day one. It was not something that he thought up later. It was from day one. The first class of the TIFR, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and the people who then formed the weapons cell and so on and so forth, P.K. Iyengar and others, were instructed by Bhabha from day one that we have a weapons thrust, and we reached the weapons threshold and capability in February of 1964. In other words, we reached that capability, did nothing about it. This is where I think, unfortunately, Nehru's playing Hamlet worked against us. So Gija Shankar Vajpayee, I think, defined Nehru as the Hamlet of Indian politics. And that's what happened. He kept telling Bhabha, not now, don't test now. I'll tell you when to test. Indecisive, after having reached the weapons threshold. Just consider what the world would have been had we tested, gone ahead and tested when we had the capability. With the plutonium reprocessing plant, the first unit came out, the batch processed in February of 1964. Nehru died in May of that year, and that was about the end of the program in a real sense, because it was such a secretive program, and it was a two-person loop, Nehru and Bhabha, the decision loop, that there were no stakeholders in the rest of the state, the apparatus of state. There were no stakeholders in the bureaucracy, no stakeholders in the Foreign Office, no stakeholders in the rest of the Indian state. And so it withered on the vine, as it were. And also, I think Lal Bahadur Shastri was trying to fill two big shoes. Now, consider also that Nehru seeded, at the time, the Maruth HF-24 supersonic jet aircraft program. Instead of importing aircraft, as we have been doing for the last 60 years, he imported designers, world-class designer, Focke-Wulf designer, Dr. Kurt Dunk. And within 3 years of his commissioning contract, he had a prototype flying in 1961. This is extraordinary. Consider where we have come from that state, the situation we were in, to now, where we look to foreign suppliers for just about everything. There's not one piece of military equipment we make that is entirely and fully indigenous. Now, fast forward to the present day. We have counterposed what was then to what is now. We have resources, but we don't have the will, we don't have the vision. And in fact, there's not the kind of critical documents in the government of India that would guide the various agencies of state to work towards the same purpose, with the same aim and objective. Guidelines to shape and configure policies. We don't have that. So each ministry and government and agency of state defines national interest in its own light, bureaucratic light. This rather unique system amongst major countries, and we are a would-be great power. Now, no other country has this sort of way of standard operating procedure. This is damning because what it ends up doing is really hurting us in a very big way. Just an example of what this means, very quickly. When the Chinese wanted to set up the aviation sector, aerospace sector, they went to McConnell Douglas and they bought off the entire production line along with the skills and expertise, CAD CAM, all the technologies. Xi Jinping yesterday signed an order for 300 aircraft from Boeing. He went to Seattle and told them, we'll buy 300 aircraft off you. But what was the condition? They're going to complete it in China. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that you're going to hand over the prime integration role to the Chinese for all the aircraft. They are going to systemically put the whole aircraft together, 300 of them. Now, see what we have done in contrast. There is a civil aviation node. As I said, the ministries all work in very different. We think that technology is in silos. So what concerns civil aviation doesn't concern the military or doesn't concern the rest of the technology base. And so there's a projected requirement by Indian airlines for some 200 aircraft, which is going to cost as much as $200 billion. And yet, we have gone ahead, we have let Indigo or whatever airline wants to buy this aircraft to sign separate contracts with Boeing or Eads or whoever, Airbus, they want to buy it from, without any technology requirement that the technology be passed back to us, or that we have any role or any part at all in manufacturing that aircraft. So all we end up doing is forking out monies to someone who'll gladly take our monies and run. So we keep defense industries and aviation industries and aerospace industries in in lots of countries. Israel, Russia, France, UK, the US is climbing on board. Which brings me to the US. We have, after I think the nuclear deal, which I opposed and just 2 or 3 of us did, we carried on a very good campaign, I think, and nearly succeeded in stopping the deal. Unfortunately, we failed. But the point was this about the deal. It is a Trojan horse. The Trojan horse not only in terms of hurting the Indian nuclear program and its weapons thrust, but it's also in terms of our getting co-opted into the US military sphere and their security architecture, rather than we engaging with the US on our terms. This is the real problem. This is despite a trust deficit that exists with the US, and it's a very real trust deficit. Look at what the US asks us to do on the liability, just for instance. They say, well, you get rid of your liability act. It's tantamount to us asking them to pretty much get rid of their Hyde Act of 2006, whatever it is, that authorized nuclear deal from their end. I mean, they don't care. And we don't seem to stand our ground. Finally, on geopolitics and geostrategy, the whole bit, I'm just sort of, jumping from point to point. But we have no geostrategic vision. We have never had it. After Nehru was the first one. In 1947, even before formal transfer of power, there was an Asian Relations Conference in Delhi in 1947, in February of that year, a few months before formal transfer of power. And there, he almost announced an Asian Monroe Doctrine system. He talked about an Asian Monroe Doctrine, supported and entirely backed up by Indian arms. And recall, in 1947, India was one of only 5 countries in the world with power projection. In 1947, power projection. The only, along with, I think, the US, Russia, UK, and Turkey, we were the 5th country with actually airborne division, 2 airborne divisions. This is the kind of, you had the wherewithal, you had the vision, Monroe Doctrine, virtually an Indian Monroe Doctrine. He gave it the Asian thing to, in a sense, legitimize it because it's trying to get, curry favor from the other young nations and so on and so forth. He did not announce it, even though it was on the agenda, because he felt and feared that other Asian nations coming up were upset with the use of the Indian army as a colonial force, as a constabulary to put down freedom movements in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. And he didn't want to upset them by propounding an Asian Monroe Doctrine. But the fact of the matter is, we have to have an Indian Monroe Doctrine in the Indian Ocean quadrant, from the Caspian to the Karnad, Central Asian republics, down to the Sea of Tonkin, Gulf of Tonkin, down to the western shores of Australia, which then closes up with the southern Indian Ocean. This is the kind of stuff we need to have, a vision that stays. It's not localized to a government in power, but that is there as an aim point for all governments to come for however long it takes. You give yourself a time frame. As I said, we have none of these guidelines. We just work on an ad hoc basis. We have what we really feel is you don't have vision. You have the hard power, as I said, in terms of you have bought your armaments and this, that, and the other, but you can't sustain any war fighting in real sense. You have expeditionary capability, but you, again, don't have a vision. And you lack the software of hard power, which is, again, to repeat, no vision, no will, no strategy, no plans. I mean, how are we to get ahead and become a great power? I think I quote Jairam Ramesh in the book saying that we are a self-professed great power. Whether or not we are is a moot point. So there you are. I'm glad he's going to launch the book. But the point, I think, is that repeatedly, even our own military people, have become like our politicians, risk-averse, unwilling to, in a sense, project and sustain your presence outside, unwilling to support a system of distant defense, which was a legacy from the British. The quadrant I'm describing, the Indian Monroe Doctrine, was the British legacy, which we squandered. And of course, there's a whole chapter on internal state of affairs, which many of you, which is really not my subject, so I have done a survey of it. But in military terms, our hard power capabilities, as I said, are, however you look at them, they are limited. They are strategic in parts, our inventory of weapons and so on. They are strategic in parts, not in whole, and we simply don't have the capability to sustain it. Even if we begin now, we're not sure when the end point will come as great power. And I don't think the change in government has made much of a difference. Just yesterday, you had the Defense Minister Parrikar, Manohar Parrikar, saying that power is enhanced by restraint. Where did you hear that before? In the previous government. You heard that. The more restraint do you hear of restraint from any other country in the world? Major country, I mean. Big power? No one talks of restraint. They talk of use of coercive capability to achieve your aims. It's not to say you go out and start a conflict. It is to say that you stand and support your interests and advance them by whatever means necessary. And again, you heard, of course, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi talk about the same, Vasudev Kutumbakam. So in one sense, the rhetoric seems never to change, the policy content never to change, and yet we expect different outcomes. What is the definition of lunacy? I'll end on that bleak note.
The author, Dr. Bharat Karnad, Shivshankar Menon, Rear Admiral Menon, Lieutenant General Narasimhan, distinguished diplomats, civil servants, ladies and gentlemen. Releasing books is an occupational hazard for serving ministers, but it's an occupation for former ministers. And I am a very poor substitute for General V.K. Singh. I have to disappoint all the TV cameras who are here awaiting his comments on OROP or on the latest revelations in the Hindu. Sad to say, General Singh is not going to be here, and I'm substituting for him. So here is the book. It's formally released. Why India is not a great power yet. And I want to congratulate Bharat for a magisterial piece of work, which I have been able to read very, very cursorily, I'm afraid, since I got the PDF version only at lunchtime. However, I did manage to go through the important sections of the book. The first thought I had when Bharat first actually talked to me about this book was a conversation that Field Marshal Manekshaw writes that he had with the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. And they were discussing films and they were discussing the lighter side of life. And Manekshaw asks the Prime Minister, Madam Prime Minister, do you ever see films? What's your favorite film? And Indira Gandhi is supposed to have told Field Marshal Manekshaw, well, you know, one of my favorite films is Peter Sellers' The Party, which was unfortunately banned in Mumbai because it was seen by the Shiv Sena then to be anti-Indian. And she quotes to General Manekshaw, Field Marshal Manekshaw, her favorite lines from that film. General Narasimhan, you probably will recall this, where Mr. Bakshi, the blundering Indian, is up to all sorts of problems at his guest's house, and the hostess shouts out to him, says, Mr. Bakshi, who do you think you are? To which Mr. Bakshi responds, Madam, in India, we don't think who we are, we know who we are. So in many ways, that was really my first reaction when Bharat asked me about why India, can I talk about why India is not a great power? We know we are a great power, right? Now, why do I say we are a great power? We are a demographic great power. We are 1.24 billion today. We will be 1.7 billion by the year 2050. That's our demographic karma. We're going to be the world's most populous country by, in fact, the year 2025, but our population keeps expanding to 1.7 billion by the year 2050, but not just quantitatively, but in terms of the age structure of our population. Unlike most countries in the world, including China, which are going to grow old and gray, India's age structure is going to remain young, and the median age of the Indian population is going to remain between 28 and 32 for the next 3.5 decades. We are a demographic great power, world's most populous country, amongst the world's youngest country, and a country that will be always in a position to reap the demographic dividend. Economic performance. Well, between 2004 and 2014, GDP grew at an average rate of 7.5%. And if GDP were to grow at 7.5% per year over the next 30 years, which is the bare minimum governments will shoot for, per capita income is going to be $12,000 by the year 2050. We would be the world's second largest economy, measured in purchasing power parity. We will probably be the world's fourth largest economy, measured in terms of market exchange rates. But this is a given. So we know we are an economic great power. Not today, we're the world's third largest economy, but our per capita income is still $1,600. But if we continue the trend that we have shown over the last decade, and there's no reason to assume why we cannot continue, if we continue even at a modest 7% per year, you're going to reach $12,000 per capita by the year 2050. So by all economic and economists' yardsticks and calculations, we will be an economic great power. A market, 1.7 billion people, growing at 7% per year, per capita income of $12,000. How can you even say yet, which Bharat says on the cover? So economic. So demographic, we are already a great power. Economic, we are on the trajectory of being a great power. Culturally, I mean, if plastic surgery was known 5,000 years ago and missiles were developed 4,000 years ago, I mean, it's a no-brainer. We are culturally the greatest power. And it can only get greater as successive Indian science congresses will unearth more and more evidence of our great achievements in the past. So culturally, why are we even asking this question? Culturally, we are a great power. We have been a great power. We have never aspired to occupy other regions. We have always tried to occupy the mind space of other regions, not the physical space of other regions, but culturally, we are the greatest power. So what is Bharat's beef? Why has he written almost 800 pages? Why has he written this? If demographically we are a great power, economically we are on the trajectory of being a great power, culturally we have always been a great power, so what is his problem? I suspect, and this is what I gather from reading the book, that Bharat's lament is that we are not a military great power. And I submit to you that this is a very narrow definition of being what a great power is. Bharat's second lament in the book is that somehow we are outwitted, outsmarted by the Chinese. And if the Chinese can do all these things, why can't the Indians do? Well, there are better experts on China on the panel who will undoubtedly respond to this line of argument. But all I can say is that I think a comparative evaluation is unfair to the political and social systems of both countries. A comparative evolution, of course, makes a lot of sense, but to assume that the Indian political system and the Indian social system, defined very broadly, will be able to replicate the type of actions that the Chinese have been able to put in place, I think is being unrealistic and making undue demands on the Indian system. So my takeaway from this book is that military power is one dimension of being a great power. We have many other aspects of being a great power, which I'm sure in the full flow of time, we would be able to harness to our advantage. A second quick observation that I want to make is that if we are a great power, and this is the point that is made in the book, if we are a great power, then we not only have certain rights, but we also have certain responsibilities. My experience in the system over the last 25 years is that we demand to be recognized as a great power without necessarily wanting to assume the responsibilities that go with the recognition of being a great power. I have seen this repeatedly in the manner in which we do our trade negotiations. I have seen this most recently in the manner we have done our climate change negotiations. We want to be recognized as a pivotal power, but we are not prepared to assume the responsibilities that go with the recognition of being a pivotal power. And that limitation is in many ways imposed by domestic politics. It is imposed by the nature of the system that we have given to ourselves. So I think this great power argument has both a recognition aspect, an achievement aspect, and also an aspect of taking on responsibilities, which I think, as of now, we are somewhat reluctant to do on a large scale, on a visible scale, for a number of domestic reasons. However, my intention was just to release the book, make some provocative opening remarks. When I told one of my panelists, I will not name who it is because it will be embarrassing, saying that, I'm only substituting for General V.K. Singh, the response was, "Oh, is that what they think of you?" So I'm delighted that this book is being released. I look forward to reading it in detail. But I do want to end by saying that this is it's a monumental piece of work, and Bharat deserves our thanks, our congratulations for putting together such a large piece of work on a topic which is undoubtedly going to gain in greater importance in the years to come. Thank you. I think we now have the panel discussion. We have the panel discussions.
What I thought I'd do is, Jairam having spoken his piece, we can go to the others, and then we can come back in the interactive stage after the other three panelists have also spoken. Shankar, would you like to go next? As you wish.
Thank you, Bharat. Some of you might be a bit surprised to see me standing here helping to launch Bharat's latest book, knowing that we have not agreed on most policy matters, to put it politely. But so why am I here? I'm here actually because he made me an invitation I couldn't refuse. He rang me and told me that, will you speak at the launch, because you figure extensively in the book and you won't like what you see. And he was right. Because frankly, I didn't recognize myself at all in this book. But he does quote me extensively. And then I realized I'm in very distinguished company. I mean, Narasimha Rao, Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh, I mean, the list of people who face the same accusations as I do is quite... So thank you, Bharat. Thank you for asking me. And thank you for putting me in this great company. No, but it's a serious book. I'm here also because I really think that this is an important book. It raises serious issues about our foreign and our national security policies, and these are issues which we need much more serious discussion in India. And so that's really why I'm here, because what he proposes, the substance of his argument is fairly simple. It's that independent India is a consistent underachiever, it's reticent, it has declined as an independent player in the international stage, and this is primarily because it's over-bureaucratized, it has a super-fragmented system of government, that there's hollowness at the heart of defense, it has a hard power deficit, and it has, most important, a lack of vision. Or as he calls it, that India may be a strategically dim-witted lug. He thinks our China policy is pusillanimous, but fortunately, the international conditions for India's rise couldn't be better. So we still have a slight chance if we do the following things. And I'm trying to summarize here, but correct me if I'm wrong, Bharat. Choose sides in dyadic situations. Side with the US against China, with Russia against China, with Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Australia against China, Iran, Russia, and China against the US and its allies in West Asia. And that makes India then a regional balancer. Secondly, as you heard him say, define an Indian Monroe Doctrine and a security perimeter which extends down to Antarctic, includes the Caspian Sea, Central Asian republics, and so on, and create a pan-Asian maritime security system. He's very positive on Pakistan, that we must incentivize our neighbors, including Pakistan, with generous economic terms to plug into India's economy, which of course is precisely what the last government tried to do. Build up strategically oriented conventional military forces which are able to take the fight to China in Tibet and distant seas and prosecute expeditionary missions from Subic Bay to Central Asia, establish foreign military bases in Vietnam and so on, reorient our military effort from Pakistan to China, resume thermonuclear testing, place nuclear munitions at points of ingress on our border with China, and prosecute a tit-for-tat policy with China, nuclear arming Vietnam in return for what China did with Pakistan. Now, you would see this is a pretty broad, assertive agenda of things that he thinks India needs to do. And this summary should give you an idea of the kind of thrusting policy that he wants from. Now, I'm not going to give you a 50-minute lecture on this 552-page long book, because I think there are people who are much better qualified to speak on the military aspects. But I would like to speak really to 2 points, to what he says about India as a great power. Because one is the whole question of what is a great power. Jairam asked the question, is military power the only thing? Is this the only way you judge a great power? And the other is why and how India should become one. Because Jairam's definition of a great power, which is on page 1 for anybody who's got the book, is fairly simple. It is that it must have a driving vision, an outward thrusting nature, backed by a strong conviction, and establish distant presence and define national interests within the widest possible geographic ambit. The confidence to project and protect these interests with proactive foreign and military policies, and expansively mark its presence in the external realm. Now, is this really true in history of great powers? To my mind, no. If you look at it, this is what declining powers do. This is true of Britain in the late 19th century after the Boer War. It's true of the US ever since its moment of unmatched preponderance just after World War II. It's true of Rome after Marcus Aurelius. It's true of Qing China after Qianlong. That's when they start talking like this and behaving as a true imperial power, develop the ideology, try and spread it. Did doing this actually arrest or turn back their decline? Did it markedly change it? I don't think so. The ones who really managed decline most successfully were the British, who managed a long, slow decline into senescence. But the others actually didn't. And the risk of doing this too early, I think, is also clear from history. When you look at Wilhelmine Germany, you look at Japan, those who tried to follow these kinds of assertive policies, the ones that are advocated in the book, before they built the power base to sustain it, they saw their position decline very rapidly, and some saw calamity. So my own take on this really is that, it's rather dangerous to model all countries and all peoples as if they were sort of America in waiting, because that leads to all kinds of false prophecies and policies. So where does India stand on this historical curve of power, of great powers rising and then declining? We're still rising. We're still putting in place the sinews of power and accumulating power. We're still at that stage. She's certainly not in the ranks of the declining powers and of the mature great powers who have followed these kinds of policies. And during the period of their rise, if you look back at history, every successful great power has gone through long internal debates, has avoided external entanglements where possible, has concentrated on building her internal strength, and has actually projected or cultivated the myth that they acted abroad only reluctantly or for some superior moral reasons. I mean, the US invoked freedom, human rights, and so on, and they ultimately intervened in Europe in the two world wars only after the old established powers had successfully knocked each other out. The British even claimed to have acquired two empires in a fit of absent-mindedness. None of them declared their purpose and goals in these terms. Deng Xiaoping's 24-character strategy of keeping your head down, hiding your lights, sums up the approach adopted by successful rising powers throughout history. And the reason is very simple. Existing powers do not, or existing power holders simply do not share power easily or unless they are forced to. And it's a declared goal of the US, for instance, to prevent the emergence of any peer competitors in the world. And yet the paradox of power is that precisely those sort of Bismarckian or Metternichian policies that Henry Kissinger so consciously advocated, learned from, have enabled the rise of China to the point where she can actually consider herself a strategic competitor of the US, despite whatever economic interdependence they have. So, should India adopt these prescriptions? My answer would be not as declared policy. Never. Bharat can say this. But to expect the government of India to say, yes, we believe this, I think is too much. That's different from saying India shouldn't do some of the things that he mentions. Because if you look at the detailed policy recommendations, if you take out the more eye-catching ones, nuclear weapons, nuclear munitions on the border with China, nuclear arming Vietnam, an Indian Monroe Doctrine, if you take those out, the rest of them actually, in practice, are being done. Whether it's strengthening military cooperation with the Quad of countries, whether it's working with Vietnam, Australia, Japan, many of these things in the Indian Ocean and so on are actually underway. But I don't want to go into each one of that. In fact, I think he's right when he says that our primary strategic focus should be China, not Pakistan. But if you look at the record, it's precisely the period of the last government when India shifted its strategic focus from Pakistan to China. So my own prescription, therefore, would be that, well, speak softly and carry a big stick is still good policy. What the book seems to suggest is shout loudly and brandish whatever stick you have, because he seems to think that the stick is also rather weak. Now, that's something that I think the professionals can really speak to. But the other issue is will India be a great power, even by Bharat's standards, by what he says? I'm convinced that it will be. Now, Bharat sets up a straw man in the book by saying there are those in the Indian establishment who believe that India will be a great power through soft power. I've never heard anybody responsible saying or professing or actually acting on this belief that somehow soft power will make India a great power. Nor will it be by others giving India the status through some mysterious process of entitlement or accretion. Nor do I think it will be through a variant of this kind of Bismarckian policy, which despite all that A.J.P. Taylor and Henry Kissinger might try and convince us about, was really much simpler for Bismarck than for us. He had to deal with one continental system, zero sum, very easy. We have to deal with a continental system, which is complex. We have to deal with a maritime system. And so I think we still have a long way to go in terms of the policies. So then why will we be a great power? We'll be a great power for the simple reason that it's in India's interest to be a great power. And that brings us to the purpose of power. Why should we want to be a great power? Can't we be satisfied, as post-war Japan was for some time, no longer, with the idea of being an economic power, and that's it, and let others take care of your security? We can't accept that for a very simple reason. Our interests are unique. whether they're economic, whether they're political, whether they're security, and the function of our unique history, geography, culture, etc. So if we want to abolish hunger, poverty, disease, etc. in India, we can only do so by accumulating power and by becoming a great power with the ability to shape the international system and the environment to our purposes. India is and has been an anti-status quo power, seeking to revise and reform the international system. So in sum, I actually find myself more in agreement with Bharat than I expected to when I started reading the book and read all the wonderful things he has to say about me, which you shouldn't believe, please. I hope I've said enough to whet your appetite and to give you a sense of the sort of issues that the book raises, because these are serious issues. And these are issues that we really need to discuss in India. I hope you managed to start the debate. You've certainly done it controversially, trenchantly. Well done, and congratulations. Thank you.
Bharat, thank you very much for asking me to speak at your book launch. It is, as somebody quite described it, a magisterial work. It's a monumental piece of work. And I must say, in the short life that this book has had, it's already been described as a bold and audacious one. And that's a reputation that Bharat has earned over the years. Ever since Goldman Sachs came up with the GDP projection of 2030 to 2050, the promise of India has come under much comment. The Goldman Sachs prediction produced, these high towers with China, the US, and India, and showed all the others as small little buildings. This happened almost 12 years ago, I think in 2003. Since then, India has not kept its promise to produce one of these skyscrapers. Its GDP is currently just around 2 trillion. And we have to produce 8 to 10% growth for 10 years that was expected to produce those Indian towers. But Bharat's case of India not being a great power is not really tied to India fulfilling the promise of Goldman Sachs. He recognizes that there's a great, giant demographic dividend that India has in the next few years. And we have to convert that demographic dividend into skills, jobs, and to not falter on our journey to becoming a great power. His case is that India more or less has the wherewithal to aspire to be a great power now. If only in his words, and I quote, I think Shiv Shankar quoted the same paragraph, that India had a sense of national destiny and matching purpose, an inclination to establish a distant presence, and the confidence to protect and further these interests with proactive foreign and military policies and the building of conventional armed forces backed by a proven thermonuclear arsenal and the willingness to use coercion and force. That's a quotation from his book. There is a case here because after all, in the UK, France and Germany had less than 20% of the world's GDP in 1850 at the height of their colonial power. And Great Britain's share in 1850, when the sun never set on the British Empire, was less than 10%. So we may accept Bharat's contention that great nations must have a will to greatness, and the economy will certainly produce, a good economy will certainly produce contentment among the people. But is that enough? Because it will not produce greatness. Furthermore, in 1700, 7 years before the death of Aurangzeb, India still produced 24% of the world's GDP, but was the victim of plunder and conquest by every passing freebooter and pirate on the world scene. So it's clear that countries punch above or below their weight depending on the qualities that Bharat describes. It may be argued by some, indeed many, that great power aspirations are vulgar and unseemly in a country where the per capita income is still so low and there is so much malnutrition and poverty. Bharat's case is that the reasons for India's poverty are mostly owing to colossal economic mismanagement. In the last chapter of his book, he grapples with this issue. And in arguments worthy of a work on economics, he acknowledges the problems and the demographic bomb and the lack of skilling leading to unemployment. Bharat holds that the socialist years were wasted ones. With the country growing at 1.5% in the 50s, it would have taken India 600 years to get to current Western standards of living. He relies on the economics of Milton Friedman, the laissez-faire guru, who quotes the story of India as private success, public failure. That if India had been left unhindered by government regulation, it would have grown at the same rate as the Southeast Asian countries. Friedman slammed state controls for the harm that they do, apart from breeding corruption. He also quotes the Hong Kong-based political and economic risk consultancy, which rated India's bureaucracy as the worst in Asia, much worse than China's. He also quotes Lance Pritchett of Harvard University, who lived and worked for decades in India, who describes that there is rampant absenteeism, indifference and incompetence and corruption in every routine government service, and the bureaucracy has a stranglehold on every aspect of government activity. So to blame poverty and per capita income for the lack of a strategic vision is to beg the question as to which came first. I suspect that despite the valiant defense of his strategic vision, the last word and the last argument on the guns versus butter hasn't been articulated. But those who are in the strategic community are well aware that the defense budget is only 1.9%, whereas once upon a time, in the 80s, it was as high as 3.4%. So whether more defense money should go to poverty alleviation is questionable when the Prime Minister himself said that the leakages are as high as 85%. Bharat articulates a clear 9-point strategic vision, which is the same one that Shiv Shankar quoted from the book. He'd like the security perimeter of India, and I'd like to describe the security perimeter. He'd like it to be drawn from the East African littoral north to the Caspian Sea, to include the Central Asian republics, the Southeast Asian nations, and assume the gendarme's role in this area. He wants that we should unilaterally make peace with Pakistan and Afghanistan and build up the military strength to take the fight to China in both Tibet and the distant seas. The outward-looking security perimeter would be anchored on 3 foreign bases: Nha Trang in Vietnam, Agalega in the Indian Ocean, and Aini in Tajikistan. Needless to say, the military effort would be reoriented away from Pakistan towards China, and Pakistan would be reassured by dismantling one of the 3 strike corps of the Indian Army and converting the money saved into building up 2 additional mountain strike corps against China. The whole defense effort would be backed by a dynamic private sector, industrial base. Bharat would then like to resume thermonuclear testing and create a credible deterrent, and as Shiv Shankar said, diplomatically arm Vietnam for what China has done with Pakistan. Prima facie, a number of his visions can be said to be practical, a number. A few more to be workable in a few years. And the remaining few, which are perhaps overambitious, at least early in this century, or perhaps later in this century. Remember that the Goldman Sachs prognostications were for 2030. And even these predictions are unlikely to be met by Indian economic growth, which has yet to touch 8 to 10%. At present, we have the dreadful reality of a 2 trillion economy against China's 9 trillion, and a defense budget of 39 billion against China's 150 billion. So the underlying factors may change in course of time, but until they do, ambitions which cannot be militarily supported by the economy will, I think, have to wait. As I said, the current maritime perimeter is not far different from what Bharat would like it to be. A reconnaissance base in Agalega would also probably be affordable. But my problem would be to stick the Indian head into the beehive called the Middle East. Bharat's perimeter, drawn from the Horn of Africa to the Caspian Sea, more or less bisects the entire Middle East and would include in the Indian perimeter parts of Yemen, Oman, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and many other countries which, as far as I am concerned, are not worth the trouble policing. Unless, of course, this part of the perimeter is a bit negotiable. And one can draw a line direct from, say, from the Horn of Africa to Aini and not go to the Caspian Sea. The Middle East is a veritable cauldron, in my opinion, and I am not sure that anyone polices that area, not even the US, with its 11 aircraft carriers. And I think this is an area we should stay well clear of with its latent and explosive Shia-Sunni divide, likely to blow up at any time. The two chapters that I like best in the book, and I think which are best argued, are chapters 4 and 5. That's hard power and the deficits of strategic planning and military infirmities and strength. It's true that in the transformation of foreign policy from non-alignment to whatever it's currently called, strategic autonomy or non-alignment 2.0, there is little cohesive understanding in Delhi of hard power. This deficiency is largely institutional, with little coordination between the armed forces and the bureaucracies of the MOD and MEA. The military, for instance, sees foreign bases as means of extending military reach. The bureaucrats are unwilling to agree on the basis of ideological and moral grounds based on the vestiges of a colonial past. The Indian Air Force is the 4th largest in the world. The Navy is the 7th largest. It would appear that in the higher reaches of the armed forces, the strategic mindset is beginning to shift from defending territory to one of defending a strategic perimeter and enforcing the country's interests within that perimeter. From the days when the Air Force brass used to talk of defending national airspace, the current Air Chief talks of providing the capability to influence the environment from the Suez to Malacca. This is a great improvement. These are welcome changes. Nevertheless, the author criticizes the armed forces of belonging to the industrial age and incapable of understanding the technology to win the swift, brutal wars of the 21st century. The author criticizes the Air Force as being seriously deficient in understanding technology and being overtly tactical. This, he feels, comes from a Pakistan fixation and not retrofitting older versions with the latest technologies. Now, whether this is a justified criticism, we can discuss it during the discussion period. The army, he feels, is comfortable being the way it is, as over some decades now, it's had so much success in counterinsurgency that the higher ranks are filled with officers who cut their teeth again and again in counterinsurgency. The army is heavily infantry-oriented and is happy to be that way, not interested in wars of technology and maneuver. Ever since the coalition forces demonstrated the revolution in military affairs in 1991 and later on in 2003, the Indian Army has still not put through any reorganization to fight in the modern way. Many of the technological changes Bharat acknowledges will be made up by 2025 or 2030, when, for instance, much of the IAF's shortcomings in fighting in Tibet will be overcome. Because without air power, no other force can fight a decisive war. Bharat's idea of the defense perimeter, and even then, it is still not sure that the government is supportive. He bitterly criticizes the delays in inducting air-to-air refueling in the Air Force, for instance, and the acquisition of a true bomber, although it must be conceded to the Air Force that the IAF has conducted some very impressive long-range sorties with the Su-30. The author feels that the local shipbuilding capability, the Navy will have adequate forces by 2030, including an expeditionary capacity that can challenge China's presence in the Indian Ocean. According to the author, the government sees naval power as a winning card against China. The Navy has begun to take cautious steps in setting up INS Baz in Campbell Bay in the Nicobars and launching its own communication satellite, Rukmini, which may all help to hold the Chinese in the Indian Ocean. Of course, since then, the Chinese have come up with a maritime Silk Road, and the outlines of which are not yet discernible. Certainly in the near future, India remains superior in the Indian Ocean, unless the PLAN expedites its Shang-class SSN building program and feels confident of the situation in the West Pacific to deploy them in larger numbers to the Indian Ocean. The author has doubts about India's aircraft carrier, but this is an old chestnut, and I think it's better left for the discussion phase. In terms of likelihood of war, Bharat concedes that the punitive action against Pakistan in response to a terror strike remains the most likely scenario for war remains the most likely scenario for war on the Indian subcontinent. Incidentally, what I want to say is that wargaming, which has not been done in India but which has been done abroad at the Track 2 level, confirms that Pakistan's nuclear threshold is actually at a fairly robust level and also varies depending on what India does where with what. Bharat nevertheless feels that 3 strike corps is too much for this purpose, considering that armored and mechanized forces, and here I must say he has done some magnificent deduction of defense expenditure, that mechanized forces consume 23% of the defense budget, as against 10% for the mountain divisions, 20% for air domination, and 11% for sea control. These are interesting statistics and demand certainly a better budgeting system and better higher management of the defense system. Lastly, as Shiv Shankar said, this is a book that boldly argues an alternative strategic vision. If India makes its demographic dividend productive and grows at 10%, many of Bharat's views will become or could become reality. His case is that we are punching below our weight even now, and the shortcomings of the Indian state are largely in the Indian mind. Thank you very much.
Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Mr. Menon, Admiral Menon, and Dr. Bharat Karnad, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I must apologize for that late entry which we did today. For a moment, I forgot I was in Delhi. Though I was in Delhi sometime earlier, my last 2 postings are outside Delhi. One was in the northeast, and I am now in the central India. And there we don't get into the kind of traffic problem that we face in Delhi today. My apologies, sir. About 2 months back, when we were having a seminar in ORF, that is the time Dr. Karnad asked me, I would like you to come and take part in the book release of mine. I said yes, but then I didn't know what I was getting into. The book was fairly voluminous, as you can see it. Notwithstanding that, it gives us a lot of data, a lot of points to ponder, and a lot of issues on which we need to really work on. That is not to say that I agree with all the things that have been said in the book. Like my previous speakers, I also have a lot of observations and a lot of questions which come out of my mind when I read this book. What actually he highlights is, in the first part of the book, is that we need to have a synergy within the various departments of the government of India. I can't agree with him more. He also talks about what Mr. Menon highlighted earlier on the various groupings and how India should probably interact with these groupings. There I have a lot of questions. He talked about military procurements, and he said the government probably doesn't even ask what the military forces wanted to buy. I wish he was in the government. We would probably get a lot more than what we are probably getting now. He also said India punching below its weight, and he quotes Hanuman in this. And he says Hanuman was diffident before he went on to do what he did. And somebody had to probably prod him to say that you have this power and you use it. And probably that's what he intended to do by this book, to those in power to say that probably you need to look at these issues. He talks about Mr. Nehru and his policies over a period of time. And somewhere down the line, he also feels that India cannot probably become a power unless it has got a strong military. But the initial stages of independence, we had other problems to look into. We are a poor country. We need to grow economically. We also need to bring up the population's standard of living. And we had health issues, education issues, whole lot of that. I can understand at that point in time that we didn't have the wherewithal to build that powerful military. Now we are probably in a position and we are slowly getting there. He also compares China's aggressive behavior with India's moderate behavior. He feels that probably China has achieved much more by that kind of a behavior than what we have done with the moderate behavior. But my reading is slightly different. In fact, Chinese, by whatever they are doing, because of the way they are doing it, they are probably getting a lot of bad publicity everywhere. Look at some of the countries in Africa. Look at Myanmar. Look at any other place. They are not very popular at this point in time. So probably we have a stronger point the way we do things. The schools of thought on great power, he talks about this, and he talks about 3 schools of power. One, he says, is soft power. Second one is considering the morality considerations, morality aspect. And the third one was the contradictions. I would say a fourth one we need to look into. That probably we do have a lot of people who still think that we can become a good power. I agree with Dr. Jairam Ramesh when he said that we are already a superpower, but still, we have little way to go. I also go by that. And by that point, we have a lot of people who believe that we have the potential to reach there someday. So that is the fourth view I would like to put into this. He talks about missed opportunities. We do understand the opportunities were missed. But please also bear with us. He talks about 4 or 5 of them which we missed. The UN Security Council seat was offered to us. The ASEAN entry was offered to us by Indonesians. The Singapore port was offered. Sorry. The aircraft Tu-22M was offered by the Russians. And also the Cameron Bay was offered to us. But what we are doing now is, we are looking at it all in hindsight, 50 years down the line. Probably the stage at which these decisions were taken, the decision may have been right. We don't know it as yet. So probably in hindsight, this may look good, but at that point in time, we don't know actually what drove these decisions. He also wants us to rewrite the rules. He says no country has become a powerful country or a superpower without rewriting the rules of the game. And probably he also says that we need to probably go and rewrite these rules. I'm not so sure of that. Probably even within, I for one believe if you want to change the system, you need to be in the system to change it. So if you start rewriting, to rewrite, you know to rewrite, and we need to get that power first before we start doing these things. He also talks about Mr. Ramachandra Guha's 7 reasons as to why India will not become a major power. And he talks of the reasons that are given are, one is the Naxalism, Hinduvadi, rich-poor gap, trivializing of media. My media friends here, please take note of it. Environmental issues, and the lack of power because of a coalition government. In all this, if you see, only one issue needs to be tackled, and if that is done well, we'll be there. And that is strengthening the central government. You do that, rest of the things will fall into place. The military power will automatically build if economy builds up. He talks about exposing this military power. He talks about applying this military power to reach there. But to do that, we need to probably deal with economy first. Dr. Jairam Ramesh told about a number of factors because of which we are a power to reckon with. We all know that the comprehensive national power which we talk about comprises of hard and soft power. Soft power, we are well up there. As far as the hard power is concerned, we have some way to go. And therefore, we need to probably work towards that end. He talks of that friendly neighborhood policy. For some time, yes, we didn't look after the neighbors very well, but I think we are on the right track at this point in time, and probably will do better. He also talks about looking at Pakistan a little differently and in a softer manner. This also reflects in Dr. Shashi Tharoor's book, Pax Indica, if you have read it. He also mentions these kind of things. I would like to take their mind back to only one thing. You can extend the olive branch every time, but how many times will you probably get paid back differently? That is something you need to keep in mind when you do this. Force ratios, he talks about force ratios. China is 1:3, we need to get to 1:1.5, and we'll be probably be 1:2.1 when we get this mountain strike core going. But this kind of a force ratio calculation is misleading. It basically does a bean count and says that you have this potential which you can probably match. But please understand, anybody may have any amount of divisions, any amount of troops, but how do you employ them? And where do you employ them? And the place where you employ them, do you need that kind of force ratios? Is something that you need to look at. The mountainous terrain that we have with China restricts its employment. So therefore, we need to take that with a pinch of salt and say, okay, do I need that ratio or can I do with something different? That is something we need to think about. Retrofitting of the equipment, Admiral Rajamenon also mentioned about it. I think we do it plenty. Probably we don't say it, but retrofitting of equipment has been going on for a pretty long time. And that saves a lot of money, by the way. Army, he says army is risk averse. I don't know where he got it from. If army were to be risk averse, I wouldn't be standing here. And he also says, what Admiral Menon said again, that people go and do some punching in insurgency areas. They get added marks for their promotions. They don't get any added marks. The issue is this. Unfortunately, India has got an army which is perennially engaged in a counterinsurgency operation in J&K and the Northeast. We all know it. Whether you like it or not, everybody has to serve in these areas. So please don't blame them for serving in those areas. They're only doing some good for you. He also talks about military not supporting indigenization. I don't know where he got it from. In fact, we are the ones who are saying, you give us something indigenous, we'll take it first. But the fact of the matter is, somebody should give us something. We are looking for it for the last 65 years and we'll continue to look for it. He talks about Colonel Das's experience on development of that equipment called Sati, which is a handheld computer which helps the infantry soldiers. And it's part of a equipment which could be considered as the future infantry soldier system. I would have probably preferred he talked to that person who developed it, and then there's a lot of bad-mouthing going on about senior officers in the army. That's fine. I would have probably preferred if you could have spoken to one more senior officer and got his view. You would have got a different perspective of this. He talks about naval and air force successes, diffidence again. I would rather say that whenever we have done exercises with any of the foreign countries, may it be US, may it be UK, may it be anybody, you talk to those people who have done those exercises with us, they'll give you a different story. We may be still flying those MiG-21s, but we fly them very well. We may be having those old ships with us still. That will change soon with all those ships being built. They have only praise for us and nothing else. You need to probably talk to some of them before you take this decision. He talks about tactical nuclear weapons in this book a lot. And in the morning we had discussion again somewhere, and then he also mentioned about tactical nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons have to be again looked at with a pinch of salt. The reason being, whether it is tactical, you may call it tactical, but the moment you apply a nuclear to it, then it doesn't remain tactical anymore. It gets into the realm of strategy, and then the spiraling of the counteraction is uncontrollable thereafter. Lot of comparison goes on in this book between us and China. Mr. Menon talked about the different systems. When I was in China with Mr. Menon, I was serving with him. And I came back to India after a year and a half. And somebody in the army headquarters asked me, "You must be feeling sad to come back to India." I said, "You don't know how happy I am." The reason I gave was, you don't know what is the price of freedom. You go there, you get followed, you get seen, everything is done. Here, you are a free man and you are able to do what you want to do. We talk about a lot of these internet restrictions and restrictions on religion, restrictions on everything else in China. The price of freedom is something which we need to pay, and probably in the delayed development and the military build-up, military modernization is the price probably we are paying. But we will get there. He talks of the strike corps and the armor. I don't know, Ajay Shukla is here. He's from Armored Corps. He seems to have a lot of negative feelings about Armored Corps, and we are spending a lot of money on them. But again, I would like you to put it in the time frame at which these things were done. Please look at the time frames at which these were bought. Please look at the situation that was prevailing between India and Pakistan. Please look at the freeze of relations between India and China post-62. Then you will realize as to why these things were done with a particular purpose in mind. Lastly, in the last part of his book, he gives 10 points for becoming a superpower. And Mr. Menon talked about it. I will give you a little different take. In addition to whatever he has said is fine, but I am still contemplating whether it is doable. A lot of things we need to deliberate in a detailed manner before we do this. But I wanted to add a few more issues to it. First one, I agree with him on the synergy aspect of it. The various departments of the Government of India have to be synergized to move ahead, number one. Number two, the economic growth should be taken care of, and along with that, we need to ensure that this economic growth and the prosperity spreads across the entire population. It is a tall order, it will take a lot of effort and a lot of work, and we need to do it. We also look at bringing the social parameters. One, when the social parameters, when they come out, whenever the analysis takes place, we are fairly low in the social parameters. We need to probably look at the social parameters in a little more detail, and we need to include the skill development of the youth bulge. The problem is we have a good amount of youth, but if we don't equip them well, and if we don't ensure that they give the returns to the country, we are going to be left with a major problem on our hand. And lastly, but not the least, we need to do the military modernization. I really don't know whether to pity me or him. On that note, I'm going to finish. He talks of the military leadership as unimaginative leadership, foresight challenged. Well, some of us may be, I don't say that. But the fact of the matter is, majority of us are not. I also would like to conclude by thanking him for having given me this opportunity to come and take part in this event. And I also probably share his, I would say, the feelings when all of us have said a lot of things which could be probably contradictory to what he meant. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. I'll just make a few points and then we can end. Basically, I think you had the panelists I'll talk generally about what was said. Two strawmen have been created. One is the economic power, that somehow we have to, the sequencing aspect, that we should become an economic power first before we become an great power. I think that's a strawman, because it suggests that military capability is dependent on how well you perform economically. Actually, there's no connection in terms of, if you look at historically how nations have become great in the past. It's usually very poor nations who have taken, you have done very ambitious and risky things that have won the rewards of great power. And I mean, for instance, and I can go back as far as Elizabeth in England. I mean, in 16th century, England was a dirt poor country. A dirt poor country. And Elizabeth I, who had, she had no money. And her advisors said, no, don't build up the navy. We can't afford it. She said, no, that is the bulwark of the kingdom, of my realm, and I'll have a navy. So she had a navy. And that was the beginning of Pax Britannica and the deployment of the navy to the Copenhagen seas and the northern thing, and then dismantling of the Spanish Empire, Spanish Netherlands, and so on and so forth. That was the beginning. Look at Mao. He stressed hard power. And let's not beat around the bush. He stressed hard power because he said that's the way that you become great. Power coming from the barrel of the gun and so on, his basic aphorism. The point I think he made is what he implemented. Within 3 years of his first test in 64, in 67, he had gone thermonuclear with a megaton. That's the year at the University of Michigan commencement address that McNamara said, we cannot anymore. We are now deterred by China. In 67, China was not a great power. The point to make is, you keep talking about sequencing, economic power, so on. It is the use of resources. Even if you have, say, 3%, that's what the 13th Finance Commission recommended, that 3% of the GDP should be spent on the military, on building up the hard power, let's put it that way. We have not even reached, as Admiral Menon said, now we are at 1.9% level. It might be a bit more at 2.24, depending on how you really aggregate the costs and so on. But the point to make is, it doesn't matter if you get 5% of the GDP if you misuse the resources. And my point I made is that despite been given the resources, the military has, in a sustained fashion, misused them by upkeeping legacy forces, which have no relevance. The reason I come down hard on the mechanized and the armor element is not because I don't have cavalry generals as friends, but because I think they're dated. I mean, if you're going to refight the Second World War with von Manstein in mind, then you have a real problem. The transformative capability of the Indian military is really very minimal. And the Saathi that I have explored at some length. Incidentally, General Narasimhan, I have talked to General Staff officers, and I wouldn't name them because had I put in what they said, it would have worsened, the military's reputation. I'm telling you this. And one of them was my classmate, who at the army commander level. So I know what I'm talking about when I restricted to Colonel Das, who headed the project. But the point to make is and it's not just the army, the Air Force at Kargil, in the first 3 days of the war, you had 3 aircraft down. The MiG-27 the first day, MiG-21 the second day, and Mi-17 helicopter the third day. This is extraordinarily atrocious attrition rate. Why was that the case? Because the Indian Air Force had never thought about an air war in the mountains. I mean, they were talking air superiority all the time, not ground support. So when they were called down to do it, they had never practiced, bombing and targeting, the adversary in the mountains. And then the problem was that the solution, like using the lightning, infrared imaging pod and so on, targeting pod on the Mirage and other aircraft, and the use of the CCRP on the Mirages, the computing point technology on the Mirage 2000, and using GPS on the MiG-21s with literally a stopwatch, the pilots in the MiG-21s, for bombing on coordinates sent to them by the army designators and so on and so forth. These solutions were worked out in the field. But there was a lapse of almost a month and a half before the technology was approved to be used. Why? Because the higher up, and I don't mention the names, but and this is tackled in Lambert's study, RAND study, Air War at 18,000 feet, wherein he says the senior commanders were simply not cognizant of the technology. So while the junior officers were all ready and they understood how to work from the failures, they learned very quickly after the first 3 days, it's the senior commanders who wouldn't approve the tactics and use of solutions that had been worked out. Because again, as Lambert says, and he's the RAND aviation specialist, because they had not practiced, they had no empathy. In other words, those people who were leading the commands at that time in the Air Force had, in a sense, plateaued out in the technology skills to the MiG-21s, whatever it is that they had. And when they became senior commanders, they didn't keep up with technology. This is the point. That the transformative capability of the country, of the military, is really lacking. And this is really brought out by a continued investment in armor and mechanized. If you're going to spend 23% of your resources on armor and mechanized, there's really very little left for anything else. And by the way, I've said dismantle 2 strike corps, not just 1. And I've said have 1 composite corps with independent armored brigades, and that should be more than enough to deal with the defensive warfare you, at the most, you're going to have with Pakistan, for God's sake. At least, every time you talk about Pakistan, we get all worked up because that, it gets worked into our animus, a social animus, I suppose, the Hindu-Muslim tensions, whatever it is, we've externalized it. And the real problem is that we see the larger threat, the greater challenge in China, and it goes unaddressed. Because we keep making excuses. Just the other day, General Sohag, the Chief of the Army Staff, talked about short, intense wars, and so on and so forth. And they're going to practice a similar exercise in a few weeks' time in the Rajasthan desert against Pakistan. Do we talk about having short, intense wars against China? Because they keep provoking you. How come you're like a dormouse where Chinese are concerned? You have your tail between your legs. How is it? So is it then the case that you then, the metric to judge your military capability is whether or not you can beat up on Pakistan? Is Pakistan a threat in realistic sense? Pakistan is not a threat. That's why I've said besides the debombing of the 2 strike corps, you really have to begin addressing Pakistani concerns. For instance, like withdrawing the short ballistic nuclear warheaded Prithvi missiles from forward deployment. That's the sort of thing that will convince the Pakistanis, and not whether you can co-opt them to trade and commercial means. You have to address the Pakistan army, which is the main player there. I mean, the point again is that somewhere down the line, we have to have a vision that drives, and unless we have it, and that's where that's the great lack there, the great void, quite apart from everything else that we talk about. And that is, I quote Sir Reginald Custance, the Admiral in the Royal Navy, who said that there is will to power and there's will to security. And my argument is that India has a will to security, but we do not have the will to power. And that's the great crucial difference. And we keep making excuses as to why we can't do this, we can't do that, we have to have economic power first, we have to have this and that and the other. Because beyond a point, I think excuses stop, and you're going to be judged by whether or not. And by the way, the Southeast Asian states, everybody else looks to India, and they're again and again disappointed. And then one last thing. When we talk about India as a security provider, quote, security provider, which we all read about, that role was first talked about by the US. Did we think of ourselves as security providers before the US legitimized it for us? Did we again, it is the US companies, General Electric and everything, in other companies, that actually discovered India's frugal engineering capabilities, because they've set up their R&D here. Before that, did we even understand or appreciate the kind of talent we had? So in other words, we seem to be externally driven in everything, not internally motivated. If someone says, you're a great power, we'll say, yes, we are a great power. So we want to be a great power by acclamation. And that's what I mean by entitlement. And no one's going to give you that status, for God's sake. Just look at what has happened in the United Nations Security Council. You must have read in the last few days, where Russia, China, and US, in a sense, conspired to ensure that the negotiating document wasn't even accepted. They failed. And we consider that a big diplomatic success for us. When in fact, we should have known from day one that we are not going to get entry unless our policies are disruptive. This is the thing about great power. Great power is acquired by disruptive policies. You cannot be, it's like being inside a tub and trying to pick it up. You can't do it. You can lift it up from the outside. But we try to be in the system and try to change it. Won't work. When you say you have to rewrite the terms, this is it. But unless we do that, I think we're quite happy being what we are, which is really, as I said, one of the inconsequentials in the world. If you're happy with that, well, who can blame it? And as Jairam said, we can happy being great power in situ. Demographic, this, that, and the other, economic power, without any great effort. If someone acclaims us as great power, I suppose that's good. But thank you awfully much, all of you, and the panelists in particular. Jairam, thank you for coming in at such short notice. Shankar Menon, Admiral Menon, and General Narasimhan. Thank you all very much.